April 9th, 1945. As Nazi Germany collapsed in fire and rubble, a different silence settled over a forgotten courtyard at Flossenburg. There, beneath a gray Bavarian sky, a man stood barefoot on frozen stone. No uniform, no trial, no last words. He wasn't a traitor. He was a general. He had warned the Allies. He had tried to save lives. He had nearly changed the course of history. But his crime wasn't failure, it was conscience. And for that, they gave him no medal, no mercy, only a punishment designed to erase him from history itself. And for that, the Reich gave him its most cruel sentence, a slow death by piano wire. A punishment so rare, so symbolic, it was used only in the final acts of vengeance. He didn't tremble. He stood still, not as a man defeated, but as one who had already defied the most terrifying empire of the modern age from within. This is not the story of a hero who rose in glory. It is the story of a soldier who disobeyed, of a man who chose resistance over rank and conscience over command. And it's a story we were never meant to remember. But history left traces, and now the silence speaks. Welcome back to History Unraveled, where the past is brought to light. The wire hadn't even stopped swaying, but history, as always, moved on. By the time Allied boots reached the gates of Flossenburg, the men who had carried out the execution were gone. The gallows had been dismantled, the bodies buried hastily in unmarked soil, and the name of the man who died that morning, a man once entrusted with military secrets at the highest level of the Third Reich, was already vanishing from memory. But the story didn't begin in a prison yard. It began almost 6 decades earlier, in the shadow of empire. August 9th, 1887, Dresden, German Empire. Hans Oster was born into a house of discipline and faith. His father, a Protestant clergyman, instilled in him a deep sense of order and purpose. Growing up in a rapidly industrializing empire, surrounded by parades and military pride, young Hans quickly chose his path. Service. In 1907, he joined the Imperial German Army as an artillery officer. Quiet and deliberate, he advanced not through charisma, but through competence. Colleagues noted his precision and seriousness, traits that would define him throughout his life. Deployed to the Western Front, Oster saw the worst of modern warfare. Trench fighting, gas, and mass casualties shattered illusions of honor. Yet he remained composed, and in 1916 he was promoted to Hauptmann and transferred to the General Staff. War taught him one critical lesson. Loyalty without judgment was dangerous. The Treaty of Versailles reduced the army to a skeleton. Oster stayed, serving in the Reichswehr, a quiet figure known for integrity and a sharp mind. Through the 1920s, he remained loyal to Germany, but wary of political extremes. An affair with another officer's wife ended his career. The Army Court of Honor forced him to resign. After 25 years of service, he left in disgrace, just as a darker force was rising. With Hitler's rise, Oster joined the Prussian police and later transferred to the Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence. Under Admiral Canaris, he found himself surrounded by men who viewed the regime with suspicion. He was not yet resisting, but he was no longer loyal. When Hitler purged the SA and political opponents, including Oster's friend General von Bredow, something in him broke. It was no longer politics. It was murder. That night marked a turning point. From silent observer, Oster became something else. He would no longer serve power. He would resist it. 1935, the seed underground. Hans Oster did not declare his rebellion. He didn't shout, didn't wave flags, didn't leave Germany. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He stayed. Inside the Abwehr, Oster began to build what history would later call a resistance, but what to him was simply duty. It started with quiet conversations, raised eyebrows, and unspoken agreements. While the Nazis demanded loyalty, Oster believed that obedience had become a moral failure. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, recognized Oster's mind and placed him in charge of Section Z counterintelligence. But Oster repurposed the office, turning it into a nucleus of quiet dissent. He reached out to pastors, diplomats, and disillusioned officers. He forged documents, smuggled letters, and watched in silence as Germany marched deeper into darkness. When Hitler threatened Czechoslovakia in 1938, Oster saw an opening. Alongside General Ludwig Beck and Gestapo insider Hans Bernd Gisevius, he planned a coup. If Hitler ordered invasion, the army would arrest him. Oster contacted British and French officials. He begged them to resist Hitler's demands. If they stood firm, the conspirators would act. He sent warnings through the Dutch attaché, Bert Sass, but diplomacy failed. At Munich, Chamberlain gave Hitler the Sudetenland. No war, no coup. Hitler's popularity soared. Oster's plan died overnight. Still, he kept going. Between 1939 and 1940, he sent over 20 warnings to the Dutch about Germany's invasion plans. They were ignored. He also forged documents to help Jewish families flee, working with theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer to smuggle them out of the Reich. These were not just covert actions, they were moral ones. In 1943, the net tightened. The SS grew suspicious. Oster's ally Hans von Dohnanyi was arrested with incriminating documents. Oster was placed under house arrest. His Abwehr career was over. The rebellion's heart had been pierced, but not extinguished. Others carried the torch. In 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg launched Operation Valkyrie, a bomb placed at Hitler's feet. But the table leg absorbed the blast. Hitler survived. The Gestapo struck fast. Hundreds were arrested, many executed. Canaris's diaries surfaced, implicating Oster. Hitler gave the order himself. On April 9, 1945, they stripped him. They marched him barefoot through the frost at Flossenburg. They hanged him with piano wire. He never flinched. The man who had once tried to stop a war died without fanfare, without mercy, but not without meaning. 1943, the silent room. The knock on the door wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. Hans Oster sat at his desk in Berlin, under house arrest. No uniform, no command, just silence and waiting. When Hans von Dohnanyi was arrested with documents in hand, Oster's name surfaced. The Gestapo was watching. The end had already begun. His wife, Gertrude, tried to keep a semblance of normalcy. But Oster knew. This wasn't a pause. It was a countdown. Friends had disappeared. Letters stopped arriving. The Gestapo never forgot. He feared not death, but irrelevance. That all he'd done, the warnings, the forgeries, the resistance, might fade into nothing. By now others carried the torch. Klaus von Stauffenberg, bold and determined, had become the face of the new resistance. Operation Valkyrie was a desperate gamble. Oster could only watch from the shadows. The network he helped build had taken form. The plan was underway. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb was placed at Hitler's feet. It exploded, but Hitler survived. The failure unraveled everything. Stauffenberg was executed. The Gestapo moved swiftly. Oster was rearrested. In April 1945, Hitler, reading Admiral Canaris's diaries, found confirmation of Oster's betrayal. His defiance, his work, his conscience. The order was cold. Execute him. Slowly. Oster, Canaris, Bonhoeffer, and others were taken to Flossenburg. There was no trial, no defense. On April 9th, Oster was stripped and hanged with piano wire. He didn't beg. He didn't flinch. The silence was his final resistance. Weeks later, the Allies liberated the camp. Oster's grave was unmarked, but his memory was not. In time, Historians uncovered the depth of his resistance, the early warnings, the hidden networks, the quiet defiance. Some called him too cautious. Others saw a man who fought not for glory, but for conscience. A man who tried to stop Hitler. May 1945, after the silence. The Third Reich was gone, its banners burned, its leaders dead or captured. The sound of marching boots was replaced by Allied trucks and distant sobs. Town by town, Germany surrendered. But the ashes didn't just cover ruins. They covered names, erased faces, buried stories. Flossenbürg had no monument for him, no plaque, no eulogy, just earth disturbed by shallow graves and silence. But history is stubborn, and memory has a way of breathing through broken ground. In the chaotic months after the war, Allied investigators pieced together what they could. They knew about the July 20th plot, but Oster's quiet role took longer to surface. He wasn't the man with the bomb, nor the one giving orders, but he had been there from the beginning. A portrait emerged of a man who resisted from within, not once, but for years, patiently, persistently, risking not only his life, but his soul. He helped build the resistance's foundation. Networks of trust, coded messages, moral conviction. Letters smuggled abroad, warnings ignored, identities forged, whispered plans over coffee in dim rooms. So many led back to him. Still, post-war Germany struggled to remember its resistors. The guilt was raw, the shame overwhelming. Oster didn't fit a heroic mold. He was too quiet, too early, too hard to simplify. Some dismissed him as hesitant. Others recognized the courage in his consistency. In the East, his name vanished. In the West, it lingered in silence. Only decades later did recognition begin to bloom. In 1960, a plaque appeared at Flossenbürg. In 1999, the Bundeswehr honored him posthumously. Streets were named after him. A statue was raised. But for his family, none of it undid the loss. His wife never remarried. She lived quietly, guarding the legacy of a man who refused to surrender his conscience. Today, Hans Oster's memory lives not in monuments, but in moral questions. What is duty? What is betrayal? What is worth dying for? His life doesn't answer them, but it insists we keep asking. He wasn't loud, he wasn't famous, but maybe that's what made him unforgettable. Present day, memory rekindled. In the quiet halls of Germany's military academies, the name Hans Oster is no longer taboo. Cadets read about him not as a cautionary tale, but as a case study in conscience. His story is no longer whispered in shadows. It is printed in textbooks, etched into lecture slides, invoked during oath ceremonies. Oster's path was never the easiest to honor. He wasn't a martyr in a blaze of glory. He wasn't charismatic like Stauffenberg, nor eloquent like Bonhoeffer. He was a bureaucrat, a strategist, a man behind the curtain. His defiance didn't erupt. It unfolded slowly, methodically, over years of accumulating moral fracture. Today, historians see in him something more difficult and more essential than heroism. They see the burden of responsibility, the discomfort of recognizing evil from within, the loneliness of acting against it when the world salutes the wrong flag. In a digital age where narratives are instant and morality often flattened into slogans, Oster's life resists simplification. He did not begin as a rebel. He began as a loyal officer. What changed was not his rank, but his soul, and in that transformation lies his enduring relevance. Visitors to Flossenbürg today find a modest memorial stone. It bears his name, among others. No grand monument, just granite and quiet. But there are other places where his presence is felt. In the books of students, in quiet moments of reflection among officers asked to balance duty with ethics, in families who tell their children that true bravery sometimes looks like hesitation, like doubt, like disobedience for the right reason. Hans Oster is not remembered for a single act, but for a life defined by a question. What does it mean to serve? The answer is still unfolding. It arrived in a plain envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in careful German script, the kind of letter that had no business surviving decades, but somehow did. Inside was a copy of a report written in 1943, typed on thin gray paper. The signature at the bottom, Hans Oster. The recipient was a young military archivist in Bonn. He had never heard the name, but as he read, line by line, a different history began to unfold. One not of loyalty, but resistance. And once more, the past refused to stay buried. In the post-war decades, Oster's legacy had flickered, acknowledged, then forgotten, rehabilitated, then shelved again. Cold War tensions had made heroes and villains inconvenient. But as Germany entered the 1980s, the silence began to crack. Documentaries aired. Survivors spoke. Hidden files were opened, and within those fragile folders lay the story of a man who had warned, resisted, and died without fanfare. What shocked many Germans was not just the cruelty of the regime, but how early Oster had known, how clearly he had seen it, and how methodically he had tried to stop it. This wasn't a man who acted when defeat was obvious. He resisted when it was unthinkable. When Hitler stood triumphant in Paris, when cheering crowds lined the streets, when resisting meant betrayal and likely death. And yet he did. As the evidence mounted, so did public interest. A memorial stone became a museum wing, a school was renamed, a single paragraph in textbooks became an entire unit. But more than that, the story struck a nerve. Because it wasn't just about history, it was about choice, about what one man can do when surrounded by silence. 1994, the uniform returns. The man standing in front of the Bundeswehr cadets wore the uniform well, clean, pressed, adorned with modest insignia. But it wasn't the medals that caught attention. It was the name stitched above his heart. Oster. He was a grandson, a quiet man, by all accounts. But when he spoke, every eye in the auditorium turned forward. He told the cadets not about battle tactics or ranks, but about choices, about a time when the uniform had meant something else, and about a man who wore it, not to follow, but to question. By the 1990s, Hans Oster's name had found its way back into Germany's military ethos. Not as a footnote, as a benchmark. The Bundeswehr, forged after the ashes of Hitler's Wehrmacht, had been built with one critical pillar: innere Führung, leadership from within. The doctrine insisted that soldiers were not just instruments, but citizens in uniform, that they must weigh their orders against their conscience. It was Oster's story that gave this principle flesh and gravity. He had obeyed until obedience became betrayal. He had chosen disobedience and died with honor intact. Today, when young German officers take their oaths, Oster's name is sometimes spoken, not loudly, but with weight, because the lesson he left behind is both simple and terrifying. That evil does not always come with horns and slogans. Sometimes it comes with paperwork, with promotions, with uniforms that fit too well, and sometimes resisting it looks like betrayal, until history catches up. Hans Oster didn't just warn Germany once. He warns it still. 2025. In the Shadow of Giants. It is a quiet morning in Berlin. A group of high school students file into the memorial courtyard at Flossenburg. The wind carries the rustle of trees and the faint echo of distant traffic. But here the silence is sacred. Their teacher pauses in front of a small stone set into the earth. No grand sculpture, just a name, Hans Oster. One student kneels to brush leaves from the inscription. Another asks who he was. And the teacher, no longer young, her voice steady but soft, begins to explain. She tells them that resistance doesn't always look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, like risk hidden inside routine, like courage held for years in clenched silence. In this generation, the word Nazi lives mostly in documentaries, in classrooms, in films. The horror is remembered, but often at a distance. What they don't always see is how close it once was, how ordinary people became part of it, how a decorated officer deep inside the system chose to fight it. She tells them about Oster's warnings, his forgeries, his sleepless nights, his final hours. She tells them that he tried to stop Hitler before the world burned, and that he paid for it. The students listen. Some take notes. Others look away, toward the sky. But in their silence, something settles. A question. What would I have done? That question is the inheritance Hans Oster left behind. Not just for Germany, but for everyone. Because the threat of tyranny is never distant, and the price of conscience is never cheap. Somewhere in every generation, a choice waits in silence. Oster showed us how to answer. History has a strange way of correcting itself. Not always through justice, but through memory. Hans Oster was not a man of monuments. He wasn't seeking glory. He didn't shout into microphones or wave flags. He wrote in quiet rooms. He passed messages in hallways. He told the truth when lies were the safer currency. He wasn't remembered because he won. He was remembered because he was right. In many ways, Oster's story is a warning about what happens when institutions obey too easily, when loyalty outweighs morality, when conscience is suppressed in the name of unity. But it is also a gift, a reminder that one man, with no army behind him, can still make a mark deep enough to scar tyranny. No book could fully capture the weight he carried. No film could recreate the silence he endured. His story is one of fragments, letters, whispers, small acts of rebellion. But when pieced together, they form a legacy stronger than propaganda ever was. They stripped him not only of rank, but of recognition. They marched him into the cold without boots, without ceremony, without a name. They used a wire meant for music and turned it into a noose. And when his body fell, no anthem played, only silence. But silence remembers. He wasn't a martyr because he died. He was a mirror because he lived. He reflects the hardest truth, that the real battlefield is not always in the trenches, but in the soul. If history asks anything of us, it is not to idolize Hans Oster. It is to recognize ourselves in him. To wonder, honestly, uncomfortably, if we had been there, would we have stood up? Would we have risked everything for people we might never meet? And if we are here now, what are we willing to risk today? The world doesn't always offer clear villains, but it always offers the chance to be decent. That is what Hans Oster gave us. Not the perfect legacy, but the perfect question.